"I've got a spare room," he said. No questions, no pity, just those 5 words, and the way he set his hat down on the table like the matter was already settled. Snow on the sill, a ring of iron keys beside a cold cup of coffee, and a stack of papers, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, laid open under the lamp for a room full of men to read. Here is what you should know before any of it. Etta Gray came to Fairhope with a scandal trailing behind her like a torn hem, 30 years old, and counting her last coins on a bare table. She owed money on a scrap of land, and the man who held the note had already decided a woman alone could not pay it. He moved the deadline. He refused her partial money in front of witnesses, so the whole town could watch her come up short. She had days. That was all. Days to lose the one thing that was finally, wholly hers. So why would a quiet man, a man who split his own firewood by hand, though he owned the only working mill in the valley, a man who had not set foot in a church since the fever took his own daughter, why would a man like that offer a spare room to a stranger the town had already made up its mind about? Not because she was pretty, not because she asked, because he saw what she was afraid to say out loud, that she had run out of people to turn to, and he handed her a door instead of a verdict. And here is the thing she was really afraid of. Not the cold, not the empty purse. She was afraid of being unwanted, afraid there was an age past which no one comes for you, and that she had already crossed it, somewhere between Chicago and here. She was wrong about that. It took her a whole winter to believe it. Before I tell you how a spooked stallion and a stack of weather records turned this town on its heel, do something for me. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. A town, a kitchen, a porch. I like knowing who is sitting with me by this fire. Now, let me start at the beginning. 7 months before the snow, before the keys, before the papers went soft at the folds, there was a September road and a woman walking it alone. Etta Gray came into Fairhope on foot because the coach fare would have taken the last of what she meant to hand the bank. She carried one case. It had been her mother's, and the leather had cracked white along the corners where 30 years of somebody's hands had worried at it. The road was dust, and the dust got into everything. Her collar, her teeth, the split seam under her arm she had already mended twice. She was 30 years old. In Chicago, that had been young enough. Out here, where a woman was spoken for at 17 and a mother many times over by 25, 30 was a number people said quietly, the way they said a debt. Here's what you should understand about that number. It was not the years themselves. It was what the years were supposed to have produced by now, and had not. A husband. A house with her name spoken warm inside it. A place at some table where nobody had to be asked twice whether she belonged. She had none of that. She had a scrap of land she had never seen, left to her by a father she had buried at a distance, and a note against it she could not cover. The land sat 2 miles out. When she finally stood on it, she understood why the county had let a woman have it. It was thin ground, more rock than pasture, with one thing standing on it worth the walk. A drying shed, low and long, the boards silvered, built for wool and hides by someone who had known what he was doing. She put her hand flat on the door of it and found it solid. That shed was hers, outright. No note, no lien, no man's signature over hers. The one square of the world she owned clean. She slept in it that first night on a folded coat, and she was not ashamed. She had slept worse. Let me tell you where worse was, so you know what this woman was made of. Chicago. A tenement laundry room, 6 families to one line of rope strung across a dirt yard, and every Monday a quiet war over who got the good hour of sun. She had learned to hold her tongue there. She had learned that a woman with no man behind her is a woman whose place in line can be taken, and that you keep it by being useful, by being early, by being the one who never spilled the bluing and never asked for anything back. She thought the frontier would be different. It was only smaller. The trouble in Fairhope had a shape, and the shape had a name, though the name is not the one you are waiting for. The name was the town itself. It was the women outside the mercantile who went still when she passed and started up again when she was 3 steps gone. It was the way the story had beaten her here, a story from her last posting, a schoolhouse, a man's wife, an accusation that was never true and never needed to be true to do its work. She had taught letters and figures to other people's grown notions of trouble, and she had been let go with a month's pay and a suggestion that she try somewhere farther west. Somewhere farther west was this, and this had already read the letter that came before her. The one who wore the judgment plainest was a woman named Delphia Ross, who kept the front pew at the Fairhope Church and the front counter of every opinion in the valley. Etta went to that church her first Sunday because a woman alone who does not go to church is a woman confirming what they already think. She sat in the back. She sang when they sang. And when the service let out, Delphia Ross took her gloved hand and held it a moment too long and said in a voice pitched for the 10 people nearest, "We do wonder what brings a single lady so far from her people," as if people were a thing Etta had misplaced, as if losing them had been carelessness. Etta said she was glad of the fresh start. She said it evenly. Somewhere inside her a door closed without a sound. That was the town. Not cruel exactly. Cruel would have been easier to answer. It was only certain. Certain that a woman of 30 with a scandal and a poor man's parcel was a problem to be sorted, and that sorting her would be simple, because what could she possibly do? Now the money. She counted it on the shed floor by lamplight, because you count money differently when there is no table and no witness. Coins in one stack, the few soft bills, flattened under a stone so they would not curl. She counted it 3 times and got the same wrong answer every time. She was short, not by a fortune, by enough. By the kind of margin that in a fair world you could make up with a season's work, and that in this one might as well have been the moon, because the man who held her note had already told her, plainly and in front of others, that he did not want her season's work. He wanted her land, and she had days. You know how that kind of arithmetic sits in the chest. You have counted something out on a table yourself, maybe past midnight, hoping the number would change if you were only patient enough with it. It did not change for her either. She had one thing the town did not know she had, and I will tell you now because it matters later. Etta Gray had been raised half on a ranch not 40 miles from here, before Chicago, before the schoolhouse, before any of it. She could read a horse the way other people read weather off the sky. She knew the ear that meant fear and the ear that meant listening. She knew to breathe slow when an animal would not. Nobody in Fairhope knew that about her. To them she was a town woman in a mended dress who did not belong to the country and never would. She kept it to herself. A woman learns to keep her true skills folded small. The way you fold a good dress you cannot yet afford an occasion for. The first time she saw Phineas Tucker, she did not know his name, and he did not offer it. It was outside the mercantile. She had spent a full 10 minutes at the counter learning she could not have the flour on credit, learning it in front of Delphia Ross and 2 others, learning it in that gentle, merciless way where the man behind the counter is sorry, truly. But rules are rules, and a stranger is a stranger. She came out with nothing, and her face doing its best to carry nothing, and the wind took her mother's cracked case right out of her hand and spilled it in the road. The clasp had finally gone. Everything in it lay in the dust. A comb, a folded shawl, a packet of papers tied with string, her father's and hers now, though she did not yet know what was in them. The street had people in it. Nobody moved. Then a man crossed from the wagon he had been loading. Broad, weathered, a beard gone gray at the edges, his hat low against the sun and staying on. He was 44 years old and moved like a man who had learned there was no hurry that ever helped anything. He crouched and gathered the papers first, before the comb, before the shawl, as though he understood, without being told, which of it a person could not afford to lose. He squared the packet, tapped it even against his palm, and set it back in the case. Then the comb, then the shawl, folded once more along its own crease. He pressed the broken clasp shut with his thumb until it held. He did not look at her long. He did not ask what a lady like her was doing in the road, or where her people were, or whether the story was true. He handed her the case with both hands, the way you hand someone something that has weight. Then he touched the brim of his hat and said the only thing he said, "That clasp'll want a new pin. Cold rivet'll hold it till you get one." And he went back to his wagon. She stood in the street, holding her mother's case shut with her own two hands, and could not, for a moment, have told you why her eyes stung. It was not kindness. She had been shown kindness. It was that he had picked up the papers first. Nobody had ever, in her whole life, known which thing to save. It started with bread. The morning after the case spilled in the road, Etta walked the 2 miles in and sold her first thing in Fairhope, and it was not wool, and it was not her labor. It was bread. She had learned it in the tenement, learned it the way you learn anything with 6 families watching, which is to say well enough that nobody could fault it. She baked 4 loaves in the shed on a sheet of iron, over coals, and carried them in wrapped in the shawl, and she set up nothing, no stall, no sign, just herself on the mercantile step with the loaves in a basket and her chin level. The town went by. The town looked and did not stop. Then a wagon pulled up across the street, and the man with the gray-edged beard climbed down, and he crossed, and he did not haggle. He took 2 loaves. He paid the full price and a coin over, and when she moved to give the coin back, he had already turned, as if the transaction were closed, and returning money to a person was a kind of argument he did not care to have. He came the next morning, 2 loaves. The morning after that, 2. He did not need 2 loaves. She worked that out by the second week. A man alone and a mill and a house she had never seen but could picture, the kind a widower keeps, spare and swept and quiet. He did not need bread every day of his life. But every morning the wagon pulled up, and every morning he crossed, and every morning he said some small plain thing about the weather or the road, and took his 2 loaves and paid over. Another small thing she noticed. He always took the darker loaf if 2 were uneven, the one that caught the coals, as though he preferred the flaw, or meant her not to have to sell it second. Let me tell you what that does to a person who has been counting coins on a shed floor. It does not fix the arithmetic. 2 loaves a day and a coin over does not cover a note. She knew that. He surely knew it too. It was not a rescue. It was smaller than a rescue, and it was better than one, because a rescue you owe, and this she did not. It was custom. It was a man deciding, without saying a word about deciding, that her bread was worth crossing a street for every single morning, in front of the same people who went still when she passed. She learned his name from the merchant, who said it the way you say a name that carries weight. Phineas Tucker, owns the mill, splits his own wood anyhow, God knows why, a man with his money. She filed that away. A man with his money. She had not known there was money. He wore a coat gone thin at the cuff and boots. He had clearly resoled himself, and he bought bread from the poorest woman in the valley and took the burnt loaf on purpose. She would not have guessed money. She turned it over that night and set it beside the other things she knew about him. that he had picked up the papers first, and the two facts sat together and would not quite resolve. Autumn came on. The cottonwoods along the creek went gold and then went bare, and the mornings got a blade in them, and still the wagon came. She began to bake a fifth loaf. She told herself it was to have one back in case a customer came who never came. That was not the reason, and she knew it was not, and she baked it anyway, the darker one, and set it apart. And when Phineas Tucker crossed the street, she had it ready and would not take his coin for it. "Call it even," she said, "for the clasp." He looked at the loaf. He looked at her. Something moved in the weathered face and did not become a smile, only leaned toward one. "Clasp holding?" he asked. "It's holding." He took the loaf. He did not say thank you, and she was glad of it, because thank you would have made it a favor, and it was not a favor, it was the first thing she had given anyone in this town and had it taken clean. Then the blankets. She had brought 2 good wool blankets from Chicago and had thought, in the shed with winter coming, that she would have to sell them and be cold, because coin was coin, and warmth was a thing you could survive being short of. So she carried them in with the bread one morning, folded over her arm, and named a fair price, and Phineas Tucker bought both. All she had, every last one. Now here is the part I have turned over myself. A man buying 2 blankets in October is a man buying 2 blankets. But she saw the loft of his wagon when he set them in, and there were already blankets there, folded, a stack of them, gray army wool, more than one house could want. He was buying every blanket the valley's hard-up women carried to that step. She was not the only one. She learned that slowly, the way she learned everything about him, from the side, never head-on. He bought what people needed to sell. He paid full. He never once let it look like charity, because he took the goods away in the wagon, and a man who takes the goods away has simply bought them. Another small thing she noticed. When he lifted her blankets into the wagon, he set them down soft, the way you set down something warm that is sleeping. And then his hand stayed a half-second on the wool. Just a half-second. Then it did not. She did not sleep cold that winter. She should tell you why, and it is not the blankets, because those were gone. It was that a week after he bought them, a bundle turned up against the shed door, no note, 2 blankets, not hers, newer than hers, and she stood looking at them a long while in the gray light, and did not let herself decide who had left them, because deciding would have obligated her to give them back, and she could not afford to give them back, and he had known that too. Then, Saturdays. The first Saturday of November, he came to the shed instead of the step. He came at the hour a man comes when he has finished the week and wants nothing but to sit, and he knocked on the door of the one building she owned outright, and when she opened it, he took his hat off. In the doorway of her own shed, a man took his hat off to her. She had not had that in longer than she could count. "I brought the Mills coffee," he said. "It's better than what a man deserves. Thought you might put a pot to it." She had 1 cup. She gave it to him, and drank hers from a tin she had carried from the tenement. They sat on 2 upturned crates, with the door open to the cold, bright day, and they did not say a great deal, and what they said was about ordinary things: the road, the price of nails, a mare down the valley that had thrown a shoe. He knew animals. She could hear it under his words, the way he spoke of the mare, and she wanted so badly to say what she knew, to say she had gentled worse than a thrown shoe before she was 20, and she did not. She folded it small and kept it. A woman does not hand a near stranger the one thing that is truly hers. He came the next Saturday, and the next. All through November and into December, the coffee and the 2 crates, and the door open unless the wind was mean, and then the door shut, and the little iron stove ticking between them. Another small thing she noticed. He always set his cup down in the same place, a knot in the crate top, worn pale. Every Saturday the same knot, as if the spot were his and he was only borrowing it back each week. And when he left, he set the crate square against the wall where it had been, and once, when she had moved the water bucket to sweep, he picked it up without a word and put it back exactly where it had lived, in the corner by the door, and she understood he was a man who returned things to where they belonged, because a house where things stay put is a house where a person can rest. She began to live for Saturdays. She will admit that now. Then she told herself it was the coffee. She told herself that was that. That had not been that. The snow in the second week of December, and with the snow the hinge. The shed door had a hinge that had squeaked since the day she came, a thin, complaining sound she had stopped hearing. One Saturday he heard it. He did not say much. He turned the door on it twice, listening, the way he had listened to the loaf, to the mare, to her when she talked and thought he was not attending. 3 nights later she woke to a small sound outside and lay still with her heart going, because a woman alone learns which sounds to fear. It was not a sound to fear. It was slow and careful, and it stopped and started. In the morning the hinge was silent. There was a smell of oil on it, and the pin had been drawn and cleaned and set back, and against the jamb, where she would find it, and no sooner, sat a new pin for her mother's case, a real rivet, wrapped in a twist of paper. He never said he came in the night. She never asked. The silence between them stood as its own fact, and she oiled it, so to speak, by saying nothing, the way he had oiled the hinge so it would stop announcing itself and simply hold. Christmas passed, thin and quiet. He brought the coffee. She had saved back sugar and made a hard little cake and gave him the larger piece and took the burnt edge for herself on purpose and saw him see her do it and saw him understand that she had learned his one trick and turned it back on him, and this time the lean toward a smile got all the way there. Briefly, it was the first full smile she had off him, and it cost her nothing, and she hoarded it like coin. Another small thing she noticed, and this one she kept longest: his hands. Split wood does a thing to a man's hands, and his were a working man's hands, seamed and hard, and yet when he handled small things, the pin, the papers, the cup, the clasp, he handled them like a man who had once handled something very small and very precious and had not gotten to keep it. She did not know yet what. She only knew the care in it was old and had a grief folded inside it, and that a man does not learn that particular gentleness from wood. She did not ask. It was not hers to ask. Twice that winter their hands came near. Once over the coffee pot, both reaching to steady it on the little stove, and their fingers almost touched. Almost. He drew back first. Not fast, just enough. The way you step back from a fire you mean to sit beside a long while, and do not want to spend all at once. And once at the door, her hand on the latch, and his coming to it at the same moment, and there was a breath where both hands were on the cold iron, and neither was quite on the other. She felt the warmth come off his hand across the small gap. That was all. That was everything. She thought about that gap for a week. Why had she not closed it? She has asked herself that. She did not close it because closing it would have made it a thing that could be taken away, and everything in her life that had been a thing had been taken away, and this, the gap, the almost, the Saturday coffee and the burnt loaf, and the bucket set back in its corner, this was accumulating into something that felt, for the first time in years, like it might hold. So she kept the gap. She kept her ranch years folded small. She kept the sugar back for cake, and the darker loaf back for him, and her true skill back for nobody. She counted her coins on the shed floor and came up short every time, and the note came closer, and the man who held it moved in the town like weather she could not read. And still, on Saturday, the wagon came, and the hat came off, and the coffee went to the same worn knot in the crate top. You already know how that kind of quiet feels, like being learned by heart, slow, one small thing at a time, by someone in no hurry to finish. She did not yet know it had a price. She only knew that for one whole turning of the season, from gold leaves to hard snow, a man had crossed a street every morning to buy her bread, and she had let herself, carefully, against all her better teaching, begin to belong somewhere. The thaw came early that year, and with it Gideon Whitfield. You have not met him yet? Not properly, and that is because Etta had been keeping him at the edge of her seat, the way you keep weather off the west, glancing at it, hoping it will pass north. He was the banker. He held the note. He was a smooth, clean man who wore his collar high and his voice low, and he had a way of being sorry that was worse than any cruelty, because it wore the clothes of reason. Let me tell you how a man like that takes a woman's land without once raising his hand. He does it on paper. He does it in daylight. He does it with witnesses. The first Saturday of March, Etta walked into the bank with her money. Not all of it. She had never had all of it, and he had known that from the start, and that was the whole design of the thing. She had a partial payment counted and clean, more than a woman alone was supposed to be able to raise, enough to show good faith, enough to buy the season she needed. She set it on the counter in front of two men waiting their turn, and Delphia Ross come in for her mail. Gideon Whitfield looked at the money the way you look at a thing already yours. "Miss Gray," he said, "I'm afraid the terms have moved." She asked him what he meant, and kept her voice level and felt the room lean in. He drew out the note. He showed her a date, and it was not the date she carried in her chest. It was sooner. It was 10 days off, and beside it, in a clerk's neat hand, an addendum she had never seen and never signed the spirit of, a clause about full satisfaction, no partial tender to be entered against the principal. He read it aloud, so the room would have it. He was courteous. That was the horror of it. He slid her stack of coins back across the counter with 2 fingers, unhurried, as a man returns something that does not belong on his counter. "I can't enter partial money against this note," he said. "It wouldn't be proper. It wouldn't be fair to you to carry a false hope." False hope. She heard Delphia Ross take that phrase up like a dropped glove. Etta stood with her own money in her 2 hands, the way she had stood in the road with her mother's case, and understood that he had done it there, in front of them, on purpose. A private refusal she could have carried. This was staged. He wanted the valley to watch her come up short, so that when the land changed hands, nobody would call it a theft. They would call it arithmetic. They would call it what happens to a woman who reaches past her station. She said, "All right." She said it evenly. Somewhere inside her, a door she had propped open all winter swung quietly to. Now the town did the rest, because the town always finishes what a man like Whitfield only begins. The story moved by the week's end, and it had grown a new limb. It was not only the schoolhouse anymore, the old scandal, the man's wife. Now there was a fresh thread, and the thread was Phineas Tucker. A woman with no money and no people. And every Saturday that mill wagon out at her shed, and hadn't blankets turned up against her door. And where does a poor woman get bread flour and coffee, and a widower with money and no wife left to mind him? They did not say the word. They did not have to. Delphia Ross could hang a whole verdict on the space where a word would go. Kept. That was the shape of it. That she was a kept woman, and that Tucker, poor, soft, grieving fool, was the one keeping her. Here's the thing that broke Etta, and it was not being called what they called her. She had been called worse, in cleaner terms. It was hearing his name in it. It was standing at the mercantile and hearing 2 women go still and then start again, and catching, in the tail of it, not her own ruin but his, a good man's standing bent to fit her disgrace. He had a mill the whole valley needed. He had a name people said with weight. And she was becoming the thing that made them say it with a curl in their lip instead. She thought about the papers he had picked up first. She thought about the hand that stayed a half second on the wool. She thought, he does not know yet what I am costing him. So she did the only thing she knew how to do with a thing that was hers and precious and about to be taken. She folded it small. She put it away. The next Saturday she did not open the shed door to the sound of the wagon. She stood inside with her back to the boards and let him knock. Twice. Then a pause. Then his voice, low, saying only her name once, as a question. She pressed her hand flat to the door, the way she had pressed it that first night, to see if the shed was solid, and she said, through the wood, that she thought it was best he not come out here any more, that people talked, that he had a name to mind, and she would not be the one to spend it. Silence on the other side. The particular silence of a man who returns things to where they belong and has just been handed something he cannot put back. He said, Etta, just that. Her Christian name, which he had never once used. She said, please, go on home, Mr. Tucker. She heard him stand there. She counted it. 11 seconds, maybe, of a man on the far side of a door she was holding shut against her own heart. Then, the crunch of his boots turning in the old snow, slow, no hurry, a man who had learned there was no hurry that ever helped anything. The wagon creaked. The team that took it up the road. She slid down the door and sat on the cold floor of the one thing she owned outright and did not cry, because crying was a thing you did when you still had a choice, and she had just given hers away to keep his. The coffee tin sat on the crate by the worn pail knot. She did not move it. She could not yet make herself move it. 10 days, that was all. Days to lose the land, and she had already, with her own hand, let go of the rest. The storm came up out of the southwest on the third night after she closed the door on him. She had seen it building all afternoon, the sky going the color of a bruise low on the horizon, the air gone still and heavy, the way it does before the country decides to punish you for something. She knew that stillness. She had read it off, A Sky Before Chicago, before any of it, standing in a ranch yard 40 miles from here with a rope in her hand. She brought the coals in. She wedged the shed door and banked what wood she had, and told herself she had weathered worse in a laundry yard with 6 families and 1 roof between them. Then the wind found the valley, and the snow came sideways, wet and heavy and late, the kind of March storm that kills stock because nobody believes in it. She heard the horse before she understood it was a horse. A scream, high and torn, out past the shed in the white. Not a sound to fear for herself. A sound to fear for the animal making it. She was at the door before she had decided to be, the wind taking it out of her hands and slamming it back against the boards, and there in the swirling dark she saw the shape of him, a big stallion, storm-mad, dragging a broken lead, wheeling and striking at nothing, run off from somewhere and run straight into the worst of it. His eyes rolled white. His ears were pinned flat to his skull. She knew that ear. She had known that ear before she was 20. And behind him, afoot, floundering in the drifts with his hat gone and his coat white to the shoulder, came a man she had told to go home. Phineas Tucker, out in it, chasing a horse that was not even his to chase, on a night no sane man traveled, 2 miles from his own warm mill. Later she understood he had been coming to her. The horse was an accident of the road, but that is later. Now there was only the animal between them, huge and terrified, and a man on the wrong side of it with his hands up, saying low words the horse could not hear over its own fear. She did not think. That is the truth of it. A whole winter she had folded the one thing that was hers and kept it small, and the storm reached in and unfolded it for her without asking. She stepped off the shed step into the drifts, and she began to walk, slow, angled, never straight at him, her shoulder turned, her eyes supped down. She breathed out long where the wind would carry it. She did not reach. She let herself be a thing in the storm that was not afraid. And a frightened animal will find the one still thing and lean toward it the way you lean toward a fire. Phineas Tucker went still on his side. She felt him understand without a word that she knew what she was doing, and that the best help he could give her was to become nothing at all. She got a hand on the broken lead. Not a pull, just weight, just contact, just the fact of her at the end of the rope. Steady. Easy, she said. Not to the horse and not to the man, to the space between all three of them. Easy now. There. She turned him a half step out of the wind, then another. She walked him the way you walk something back from the edge of itself into the lee of the shed, and got the door, and got him inside where the iron stove was ticking, and the scream went out of him and became only breathing, hard and wet, and then quieter, and then the ordinary enormous quiet of a horse out of the cold. She stood with her forehead against his neck a moment. Her hands were shaking now that it was over. They always did after. That had not changed in 10 years either. When she turned, Phineas Tucker was in the doorway with the snow blowing in past him, and he had his hat back in his hand, and he was looking at her the way no one in Fairhope had ever once looked at her. "Shut the door," she said. "You'll let the heat out." He shut the door. For a while neither of them said anything. She found a rag and rubbed the horse down. He stood dripping and let her, and after a moment he took a second rag off the nail without asking and worked the other side, the two of them tending the animal from either flank with the stove between, the way they had drunk coffee from either side of the crate all winter. His hands moved over the horse the way they moved over small things. Careful, old with some grief, she still did not have the whole of. "You can read him," Phineas said. It was not a question. He said it low, to the horse's shoulder, not to her, so she would not have to meet it head on. She could have folded it small again. The door was right there in her hands, the way it always was. Instead, she was tired, and the storm was loud, and she had already given away the thing that mattered most to keep his name clean, so what was left to guard? "I was raised half on a ranch," she said, "not 40 miles from here, before Chicago, before the schoolhouse, before I was ever anybody's scandal." She kept rubbing the horse down as she said it, because it was easier to say to the wet wool of an animal than to a man's face. "I can read a horse better than most men who've worked them 30 years. I always could. It's the one thing that was ever wholly mine, and I've kept it folded up in a drawer the whole time I've lived here, because a town woman in a mended dress isn't supposed to have it, and having it would only be one more thing they could take." She made herself look at him then. "I let them think I don't belong to this country," she said. It was easier than being caught belonging and still not wanted. Phineas Tucker set the rag down on the crate. He came around the horse, slow, no hurry. A man who had learned there was no hurry that helped anything. He did not reach for her. He stopped an arm's length off, the old gap, the almost, and he looked at her steady out of his weathered face. "Etta," he said, and this time her name was not a question. "I've been buying blankets off half the hard-up women in this valley since October," he said, "so none of them would have to be cold, and none of them would have to be beholden. I got a house full of gray wool I don't need and never will." He turned his hat once in his hands. "Come spring, I mean to take the note off Whitfield's hands, or off him some other way. I haven't finished thinking it through, but that's not what I walked out here in this to say." He looked at the horse, then back at her. "A woman who can do what you just did," he said, "and has done it quiet all winter and asked nobody to be impressed by it. That's not something to keep folded in a drawer. That's the reason, Etta, not the thing you love around. The reason. He set his hat down on the crate, over the worn, pale knot where his cup went, the way he had set it on his own table the night this whole telling began, like the matter was already settled. "Save me a seat at your table," he said. "That's all I came to ask." Outside, the storm went on. Inside, the stove ticked, and the horse breathed, and for the first time all winter, she did not close the door. The stallion belonged to a man named Amos Kell, who ran cattle on the good ground east of the creek and had never in his life needed anything from a woman he had not hired. He came for the horse the morning after the storm, floundering up the road on a borrowed mule, certain he would find the animal dead in a drift. He found it dry and calm in a drying shed, eating from a woman's own thin store of grain, and he found the woman herself pouring the last of the mill coffee into a tin for a man who had spent the night on an upturned crate with his hat over his knee. Amos Kell had bred that stallion 11 years. He knew what it was worth, and he knew what it did to men who tried to lay hands on it wild. He stood in the doorway and looked at Etta Gray a long time, and then he took his own hat off, which was a thing Amos Kell did in church and almost nowhere else. "I don't know how you got a rope on him," he said. "3 of my men couldn't have." She said the horse had done most of it himself. She said an animal in a storm only wants one still thing to lean on. She did not say she had been reading that ear since before she was 20. She did not have to. Amos Kell had worked stock his whole life, and he knew what he was looking at, and what he was looking at was a woman who belonged to the country in a way half his men never would. He told it in town that same day, not as gossip, as fact. Amos Kell was not a man given to wonder, and when a man like that stands at the mercantile counter and says a school teacher walked into a March storm and gentled a stud horse that would have killed him, people set down what they are holding and listen. Here is how a town turns. Not all at once. One person at a time, the way she had been learned all winter, one small thing after another. The merchant who would not sell her flour on credit sent a sack of it out to the shed with his own hand and would not name a price. A woman named Sorreld Voss, who had sold Etta nothing all winter but a hard look, stopped her on the road and said she had heard, and that her own late husband had prized a good horsewoman above rubies, and would Etta come look at a mare that had gone sour on her. 2 of the men who had waited their turn in the bank the day the money slid back across the counter now recalled it differently out loud, the way people do when the wind has changed. They had thought it queer at the time, they said. Money is money. A note is a note. What kind of bank turns away good coin? And then the papers. You will remember the packet Phineas Tucker picked up first in the road, before the comb, before the shawl. Her father's. Etta had never fully read them, because reading them meant sitting with a man she had buried at a distance. Phineas sat with her while she did it, the 2 of them at the crate with the stove between, and what they found was not a will and not money. It was years. Her father had kept the land. Season by season, in a small hand, the rainfall and the frost dates, and what the thin ground gave, and what it withheld, and beside the lean years a plain accounting, drought, hail, the creek gone dry in the summer of a bad year. Not mismanagement, not a poor man failing, misfortune, set down honest, season after season, by a man who wanted the truth kept, even when no one would ever read it. They carried the papers to the Grange Hall, where the county kept its own rainfall book, and they laid the 2 records side by side on the long table with the men of the valley standing round. Amos Kell was there, the merchant, Sorreld Voss. Delphia Ross came too, and stood at the back where Etta had once sat in church. The numbers matched, line for line, year for year, her father's careful hand against the county's official ledger. The same drought, the same dry creek, the same hail. The land had not failed a lazy man. It had weathered hard years under a careful one, and the note against it had been a fair debt honestly carried, not the reckless overreach of a woman past her station. Gideon Whitfield was sent for. He came, and he spoke of terms and addenda and full satisfaction in his low, courteous voice, sliding phrases across the table the way he had slid her coins. Nobody cared. That is the whole of it. He was not shouted down. He was not shamed. The men simply stopped looking at him and looked at the records instead, and Amos Kell said, plain, that he'd stand good for the partial and the season both, and the merchant said he'd witness it, and the thing was settled around Whitfield as though he were a chair someone had left in the room. He gathered his papers. His collar was as high as ever. His standing was not. It would be whispered about after at the very gatherings where he had done the whispering, and it would never fully mend. Etta watched him go and felt no triumph in it. She had never wanted him ruined. She had only ever wanted her place in line, and the town at last had let her keep it. The land came clear in April. There was no grand day for it. Amos Kell stood good for the season. The merchant witnessed the mark, and the note that had hung over Etta all winter was simply satisfied, paid down honest, her name over her own. The cottonwoods along the creek came back green. The thin ground did what thin ground does in a wet spring, which is more than anyone gives it credit for. Phineas Tucker did not ask her again at her table. He did a plainer thing. One Saturday he came out with the wagon, and in the bed of it was a door. A house door, painted, hung with good brass, and beside it a small iron key on a ring. He had built onto the shed, a room, tight and warm, with a real window facing the road, and he set the key on the crate top over the worn, pale knot where his cup had gone all winter, and he did not say a word about deciding. He never did. Etta picked up the key. She did not put it in a drawer. She did not fold it small. She kept the shed, mind you, the one thing she had owned outright, silvered boards and all. But she stopped sleeping on a folded coat, and she stopped keeping her mother's cracked case packed by the wall against the day she might have to move on. She set it up on the shelf, empty, the clasp holding on its new pin, and let it be a thing that had finished traveling. When I think about them, it is not the storm I keep. It is a key set down on a crate over the exact spot a man had claimed one cup at a time all through a winter without ever once asking to be thanked. He did not save her. She saved the horse, and her father's careful hand saved the land, and the town, slow, one person at a time, saved itself the trouble of being wrong about her. He only built a room and left a door where a verdict used to be. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from and what moment touched you most. If you'd like more quiet evenings by the fire, lonely roads, quiet cowboys, and hearts finding their way home, come back for the next one.